It is my great pleasure to chair the second half of the second day of this excellent assembly, and I'm going to introduce Caroline Ehrhardt, who will be speaking to us on death, money, mathematics, life insurance in France, 1780 to 1840.
Thank you very much. I wanted really to start by thanking the organizer for having invited me to this wonderful conference and place. I enjoy being here. And so the purpose of the talk is to present a work in progress, so it's not already set. Everything's not set yet. And this investigation concerns the circulations of knowledge and the trajectories of people through which mathematical skills and know-how entered the world of life insurance in France in the late 18th and 19th century. So I have chosen to talk about this part of my research during this conference because my interest in life insurance is in fact part of a much more general historical question. And this question is that, in fact, of the various intellectual and material activities that the practice of mathematics encompasses. It is therefore in line with research developed over the last 2 decades, I would say, in the history of math, which has highlighted the diverse kinds of mathematical related practices in specific social configurations and spaces, ranging from calculating and mining to accounting and taking part to the water effort. So these studies show that not everybody who does mathematics every day is a mathematician in the scholarly sense of the word, and either in their own eyes or in the eyes of the others. And during the pre-modern and modern period at least, the know-how, techniques, and even gestures people employed sometimes overlap with those of academic mathematicians of the time, but not always. So by taking an interest in the economic and professional dimensions of actual mathematics, my research aims to shift the gaze away from the strict milieu of the academic mathematical science, which has been so far, I guess, one of the mainstays of investigation of most researchers in history of math, including mine. So the question of the diversity of mathematical activity is also directly linked to another one, which is that of the social division of the intellectual labor. Indeed, by defining what mathematics is, we also define who is and who is not a mathematician. And renouncing to postulate of a constitutive opposition and a priori hierarchy between mathematical practices such as calculating, reasoning, or elaborating abstract concepts actually means broadening the spectrum of what we take into account as pertaining to the practice of mathematics. The idea thus is to include, for example, modalities of knowledge production for which abstraction is not the end goal, or modes of circulation where explaining something is considered as important as formalizing it, or everyday uses of where mastering arithmetical techniques is enough to give meaning to something. So from this point of view, mathematics is no longer just an intellectual activity of research or training. It can also be a job in its own right. And what's more, by broadening the spectrum, we obviously also broaden the range of actors and social spaces we look at, while questioning their autonomy and interactions with legitimate scholarly institutions. So all this makes possible to picture a history of mathematics where scholarly mathematics is not at the center, and which in the case of insurance, life insurance, could be called a history of white-collar mathematics. So the relationship between actual science and mathematics has been well studied in the British and American context. For instance, Bellhouse and Alborn have notably focused on the role of mathematical experts as well as on the role of calculations and mortality tables in the British companies in the 18th and 19th century. And I can say my approach partly overlaps with theirs in that it is about understanding how mathematics materializes in professional practice and how it is embodied in modes of work organization that are not necessarily those of academic mathematicians or engineers. Other historians have questioned the question of probabilization of actual science. Deston and Porter have notably sought to understand the quite relatively low degree of porosity between probability and actual science, which a priori could have enriched each other more or earlier. But I think we can also look at things in another way. Mainly, why should insurance companies have used probabilities? What did they have to gain doing so? And also, wasn't there other mathematical knowledge involved in it? One thing Clark's book does show, I think, it seems to me, is that in the 18th century, not taking probabilistic knowledge into account was perhaps less a question of ignorance or mistrust than a kind of pragmatic reaction of insurance companies to the very imperfect nature of probabilities of the time. And it begs the question of what exactly happens as the theory of probability develops, which is beginning of 19th century. So, in contrast to Great Britain, little work has been done in France. There are, however, two national peculiarities, I would say, that I guess deserve some attention and on which mathematics has things to say. One is the local scientific context, because in fact, life insurance is emerging in France at the very same time probability is enjoying a major boom thanks to the work of Condorcet and Laplace mainly. The other is the political context. Because before the first revolution, the question of life insurance was intrinsically linked to that of the life annuities and tontines, which were themselves linked to the state's indebtedness. And we may know that during the French Revolution, the question of the state's indebtedness was a really big issue. So although there was no prior knowledge or practice of life insurance in France, they did not emerge ex nihilo. They have a lot to do with these other financial products for which the amount received periodically by subscribers depended on the age of the subscribers or on the age of the head on which the contract was made. Second, at the beginning of the 19th century, of course, the question of mortality tables was connected to the administrative reform by the Napoleonic regime, which offered possibly new way to produce statistics. So after this quite long introduction, I would like to develop a few points based on my recent research, which is still in progress. It's largely based on the archives of two insurance companies which were the first to be authorized in France. The first is called the Compagnie Royale d'Assurance sur la Vie. It started just before the Revolution, and it was forbidden in 1793 during the Revolution. This company hired somebody called Emmanuel-Étienne Duvillard de Diran. He was from Geneva. He had previously worked at the Contrôle Général des Finances under the minister Turgot, and then he went back to Geneva for several years. He published a book entitled Recherches sur les rentes, which is financial mathematics, which was approved by the Academy. And then, just before the Revolution, Duvillard went back to France and worked for the Compagnie Royale d'Assurance. Another important thing to know about him is that a few years later, in 1906, he published a book entitled Analyse et tableau de l'influence de la petite vérole sur la mortalité. It's about smallpox and mortality. And this book gained considerable success. And the next to this book contained a life table, which from 1909 to 1925 was systematically reproduced and published in the Annuaire du Bureau des Longitudes en France, which give to this table a certain publicity and a quasi-official status. The second company was the Compagnie d'Assurance Générale sur la Vie des Hommes. It received government authorization in 1819, and this company hired three mathematicians. The first one was Joseph Nicolas Nicolet. He was an astronomer and member of the Bureau des Longitudes. After an unsuccessful attempt to recruit Duvillard, the directors recruited Myrtille Mas, who was a former pupil of the science section of the École Normale Supérieure, and then Hollande Rodriguez, you all may know, who had written notably a scientific thesis on the attraction of spheroids. I will also use documents about a proposed company that never materialized by Francia de Beaufleury, which is exactly contemporaneous to the Compagnie Royale, and a very few archives from another company, which is also called Compagnie Royale d'Assurance sur la Vie, which is a bit confusing, but which in fact was in the planning stage in the beginning of the 1920s. I finally began operating in 1930. So from that, my papers will be organized around three questions. How mathematical work was carried out in a life insurance company? How did mathematics contribute to their success? And what was the role played by the scientific institutions? So the life table was at the center of the discussion of life insurance because the viability and the profitability of these companies depended largely on the accurate estimation of the correlation between mortality with age. To put it simply, several mortality tables compiling numerous observations were available at the end of the 18th century, and those who used these tables knew that the multiplicity of observation gave the calculations that could be deduced from them a character of more or less certainty. As you all know, the idea behind all this is the law of large numbers, which was familiar to probabilists since the work of Bernoulli. What is obviously surprising from the point of view of the theory of probability is that the companies were asserting that the risk was very close to zero for them and for the clients, when it was precisely this risk that should have been estimated. And what probability does this quasi-certainty, often referred to as a moral certainty in the source, correspond to? How many observations would be needed to have a sufficiently high probability of achieving this certainty? These kinds of questions were the ones Condorcet and Laplace were asking. However, the life insurance projects developed between the 1780s and 1940s did not get into such considerations. This is why I believe we often read that there were no mathematics involved, but I think that it would be more accurate to say that there was no direct link between insurance methods and the most contemporary developments of probability theory. On the one hand, in the archives I've seen so far, there are many elements that refer to mathematics, such as the use of specialized words, the applications of method of calculation, the making of the calculations themselves, and in fact, if we examine them from the angle of practice and not from that of the junction between, I would say, political arithmetics and probabilities theory, we can see that their insurance methods were based on mathematics in a various way. So I'm going to present three of them. Prior to the publication of Duvillard's table, there was no consensus in France on any of the existing mortality tables. Data on population were relatively scarce. They also did not rely on very large population, and they were not even necessarily very reliable. In that context, the author of Financial and Insurance Products readily recognized that the need to base mortality laws on observations, but this was not the only criterion one needed to decide to use a given table or not. So the very first life insurance project in France, drafted by Francia de Beaufleury and ultimately not approved by the government, offers an example. This project was originally based on the combination of the tables of Buffon and Depardieu. And Beaufleury had explicitly stated that he decided not to use the price tables, which were the ones used in England, because the mortality of men is not the same everywhere. That's what he says. But the two academicians in charge of examining this project at the request of the Minister Breteuil, who were no other than Laplace and Condorcet, took the opposite view. they said that Beaufleury should use the same mortality table as the English companies. But why did they do this? Actually, the recommendation had nothing to do with the quality of prices table or even with their greater correspondence with the reality of the French demography. In fact, as it's very clearly explained in the report, they did so because this table was favorable to insurers. And because the mortality of the selected heads, we call that tête choisie in French, I don't know if the word is good in English, this company will insure is much lower than the common mortality. And it is on the basis of the common mortality that English tables have been formed. So we can see there that the choice of a mortality table for an insurance company was not a question of natural philosophy or of statistics, even for the specialists of the theory of the probability of the time, like Laplace and Condorcet. It was not aimed to correspond as closely as possible to the real situation, but rather to shield companies from risk. And it was mostly a question of profit. This very same point of view is made clear in Duvillard's work for the Compagnie Royale before the Revolution. Part of his work consisted of calculating what the profits would be according to the type of contracts and various possible orders of mortality. He also had to consider different calculating methods and to estimate their advantage and disadvantage so that the company's director could make informed decisions. So in a preparatory document, Duvillard explained, there are two options. One is to use an order of slow mortality from sums payable to survivors, and an order of rapid mortalities for calculating sums payable on death. The mortality of Stockholm or London residents is rapid. That of tontine owners or annuitants in general is slow. These tables could be used, but it would be a considerable task. The other way to use is to use only an average mortality table, but to calculate the values at a lower interest than the one we're supposed to give. Nor then was it a question of estimating which known table of mortality the company's future customers will actually come closest to, according to an approach that would be that of the research of probabilities of the time. In fact, it was more a question that would be called financial mathematics, based on existing data and without prejudging of the degree of which it corresponds to reality. Duvillard wanted to establish a solution that would maximize the profits while ensuring customers' acceptance. However, the balance between scientific accuracy, commercial profitability, and practical feasibility was delicate to find. A response to criticism of the company's prospectus showed that Duvillard was very well aware of the limitations. In his documents, he actually acknowledged that the calculations did not exactly follow a known mortality table, since he had been modified to protect the company from losses. However, he also claimed that the calculations were still based on solid foundations, as they followed what he called a law. If we read it in detail, what Duvillard called a law was not a law in the physical science of the term. It was more of an ad hoc modification of existing tables, elaborated to compensate for identified defects of the tables, notably their inaccuracies for advanced ages, but also to limit the risks of speculation from customers. And according to Duvillard, this procedure was all the more acceptable in that, in any case, existing mortality tables were defective, is his word, and therefore did not come any closer to a real mortality order. In short, Duvillard asserted that the computational architecture of the company was designed as well as possible to take into account both the limits of democratic knowledge and economic necessities. So the men I've mentioned so far were highly trained mathematicians. The first task they had after choosing a mortality table was to turn the statistics into something that an insurance company could use. But how did they do that? The actual functioning of the Compagnie d'Assurance Générale, so the one after the revolution, before it actually got started, is quite well documented, and it allows us to understand what was the work of the three mathematicians at its early stage of developing the company. The bulk of the work did not consist of modifying mortality table, because actually at the time they decided that they chose the one that Duvillard had published in his book in 1905. Instead, their first task consisted of using these tables to calculate the prices. And in the word of Joseph Nicollet, these calculations were always long and complicated. They have been done twice, first for him, and secondly by Mas to check. The three mathematicians were also consulted on specific technical points that needed to be specified in the statutes of the company before it started. So they were asked, for instance, if it would be possible to modify the deferred annuities table, or they were asked if it would be a good idea to give the customers the possibility to set an end to the contracts before it was initially planned, or they were asked about the limits of the sum of money that one could subscribe depending on his age. So such questions, as one can see, were not part of the ordinary calculation. Rather, in this startup phase, these questions were about building the very foundations of the company. Another task the mathematicians were asked to do was to provide practical recommendations regarding the rate to apply, the age limit, and the frequency of payments. The source for these recommendations do not clarify whether they were based on original calculations, whether they were based on verification of existing calculations, or simply whether they were based on a repetition of information they had found somewhere because it was already published. But however, what is interesting that they did not limit themselves to examining these practical questions. Another type of work they had to do was to advise the boards of directors on the project to extend the activities to life annuities, because at the beginning it was only about life insurance, and so they wanted to do life annuities also. Then the task of the mathematicians was to inform the board about the details upon which such contracts could be based. For instance, they recommended the use of the Parcieux mortality table, since they are based on the population of annuitants, so more relevant to the targeted audience, public, clientele. They also specified that the benefits derived from life annuities will help to balance with the losses of life insurance if, as they put it, extraordinary events were to accidentally alter the natural order of mortality, such as epidemic, for instance. And they formulated arguments to counter any objections to the project related to his morality. Finally, their task was to draft the request for authorization to the government and to prepare the prospectus to be provided to the public if necessary. So we can see from this example that the status of the three mathematicians was not that of office workers. Their role was not limited to making and checking calculations. Rather, they acted as experts, sometimes even taking part in the board meetings. And the range of tasks they performed show that their expert and advisory role went beyond the strict confine of what often calls doing mathematics. In fact, answering this question requires them to mobilize the appropriate data, to extract information from it while using the formulas of analytical probability calculus, for instance, but also to translate all this information into a comprehensible piece of advice or an opinion for managers to help them make a decision. However, at the end of 1922, the company's board decided that Nicollet and Rodriguez would not be given a salary anymore. Mas, on the other hand, would remain as office manager. One reason for this was undoubtedly partly economic. because it saved money, not to hire people. But it was also due to the fact that the Council of Mathematicians' activities had declined sharply from the second half of 1921 onwards. As a matter of fact, mathematics had provided the method, existing literature had provided some examples, and the three mathematicians had turned all of this into tables, bylaws, reports, explanatory texts, and they have built a foundation that the directors found sufficiently solid. And so it was now time for day-to-day work. This day-to-day work, I must confess, is much more difficult to reconstruct through the archives. What I'm sure of, according to the sources I've seen so far, is that 19th century companies did have employees who performed arithmetical tasks. But these calculators then had the status of clerks rather than experts. At the Compagnie d'Assurance Générale, some employees were thus placed under the supervision of maths, which should be remembered has quite solid background in mathematics. In 1933, the Compagnie Royale also had employees they called mathematicians. They may have worked under the supervision of a man called Pellis, whom we'll talk of him a bit later, and he also had, I guess, a strong mathematical background. More generally, the idea that calculation should be done by employees supervised by somebody with significant mathematical skills was expressed here and there, as for example is this letter from the very well-known mathematician Guillaume Libri, which really badly wanted to obtain the position of manager in the Compagnie Royale. He did not have it, happily for them. But how these day-to-day operations actually worked and what was the role in mathematicians in them, well, the only source I have found so far that gives an idea of these daily works takes us back 30 years before. But it also gives a slightly different picture of it because it comes from Duvillard's paper, and more precisely from his correspondence with the director of the company he was working for. So it was before the revolution. So Duvillard had to respond to specific requests from potential customers with precise and personalized calculation. The requests they received were recorded in what they call a proposal book before being submitted to him, and then he transmitted the results of the calculation to the director when they were done. For example, the calculations that have survived in Duvillard's paper attest the fact that the table published in the prospectus, in fact, were probably not sufficient to run the business. For instance, the directors asked him to calculate the annual premium to be paid by a 53-year-old man who wishes to insure £8,000 on life annuity payable after his death to a young lady currently aged 26 and on his life. Duvillard did this assuming that the lady would die according to the Parcieux table, while the gentleman would die according to the London table, a case that was basically not provided by the price list published in the prospectus. So from this kind of source, which I didn't find a lot of them, but it looks like the company would not have had the individual case processed directly from pre-planned instructions, and that the mathematician has to do a lot of the job. I can only hypothesize about this change of organization from the 18th century and Duvillard to the 19th century and Nicolet, Mas, and Rodriguez. But I guess that Adam Smith's idea of the division of labor maybe played a role. So now turn to the third part about the social added value of mathematical skills. So even if the mathematician made little use of it in the calculation, the theory of probability did play a role in life insurance. In fact, the argument for licensing and promoting it was based in the certainty that the probability theory was supposed to provide. It is pretty clear in the avis sur diverses questions d'assurance, which was given by the Conseil d'État, which was the avis from which the insurance were authorized in France. So this document explained that probability theory guarantees the safety of such operations from the theoretical point of view. It claims that the events involved, due to their ordinary nature, follow laws, and therefore, by means of probability theory, one can achieve certainty about financial equilibrium for the company. So probability theory was a way to tame risk, and they just justified the trust that could be placed in life insurance system insofar as they put their calculations were done correctly. And the proportions to their means to their goal is calculable. So the member of the French Conseil d'État who wrote this may have been optimistic, but he was not completely naive about mathematics, as it was actually the scientist Georges Cuvier. So he knew about mathematics properly. But the real question is, how did companies get people who were not mathematically literate to trust in their numbers? The first audience they had to convince was indubitably the shareholders. While the profits of the Compagnie d'Assurance Générale remained extremely low for several years, very near to zero, the annual reports to shareholders repeatedly emphasized that the use of probabilities would inevitably ensure the company's success, explaining, for instance, that in this field the risks are known, the calculation are certain, and that the mortality law was confirmed every year by the scholars' verifications and those of the administration. So the legitimacy of the company thus rested on highlighting the scientific nature of mathematics. On the one hand, it guaranteed the protection of the investors' reputation, since they were not associating their names with a morally questionable enterprise. And on the other hand, it secured their financial investments, since the use of mathematics was understood or presented as synonymous with the absence of risk. In this context, of course, the presence of the Council of Mathematicians, these three guys at the board, was really reassuring. And the report they were writing for the company attested to the seriousness of the method in the eye of the shareholders. It actually had at least the expected effect of convincing them to stay despite the lack of profit they had for several years. These kinds of statements show that the use of mathematics was also a good argument to convince a non-expert audience. In the context of the progress of analytical probability theory, and foremost maybe on the relative popularity of Laplace's philosophical essay on probabilities, the publicity given to the application of the probabilities to the question of human life expectancy was seen by the directors of the companies as a very crucial issue. And as a matter of fact, they systematically insisted on the reliability of the data and on the role played of this very part of mathematics in this field. It's something we can see in the prospectus of the Compagnie Royale. This is written in many places. Every time you hear about life insurance in newspaper or everywhere, it's always it's the very same argument that they say. So for non-specialists, life tables were like black boxes from which tables were extracted and which linked various ages to specific amounts of money. Trust in life insurance could not come from their ability to perform or even to understand the details of these calculations. Trust came from people's knowledge on the very general way, on the principles, and in the confidence in the way the calculation had been carried out. Moreover, as the field of insurance was relatively unknown in France at the time, it was crucial for the success of the company to convince people of both the value of life insurance and of the honesty and morality of its process. And on this point, the role of mathematicians was totally crucial. So the scientific nature of the method was also presented as a guarantee of probity, with the idea that rates were not the result of a choice from the company, but for a rule dictated by mathematics. From this perspective, the publicity given to the mathematicians' work and the emphasis on their expertise was a very valuable asset that the Compagnie d'Assurance Générale made sure to capitalize on. Actually, it is no coincidence that one of the first books published in France to explain what life insurance was that of Joseph Nicolet, and was published just at the time when he started working for the company. This book was entitled Lettres à Monsieur Outrequin, etc. And in order to be readable to a wide audience, it contained actually no mathematical developments. However, mathematics were present in the book, but in other forms. First, it was a kind of argument of authority. The author was presented as an astronomer, professor at the Louis le Grand High School. It was also known that the book was an excerpt from an unpublished mathematical treatise, which actually was never published. Then mathematics was present as a kind of rhetorical and semantic arguments, I would say. What I mean is that no mathematical results were actually specified or explained in the book, but the existence of several of them, the reliable as mortality tables or affirmation of the progress in probability theory, were highlighted, just to insist on the scientific nature of the whole process. In the same way, you can find in it the name of Duvillard, the name of Laplace, just like kind of stamp of approval. And finally, mathematics was present in the book as an expert knowledge. Nicolet was very well versed in the literature published across the channel. And in this book, he developed a critical commentary of existing British works on life insurance, a commentary that was not, once again, an explanation of the mathematical foundations on life insurance, but which was, in fact, a presentation of the conclusion he had drawn from his own knowledge of all these mathematical elements. So the fact that the author presented himself as one of the few French mathematicians competent in this field, and that he was also in the service of the company, of course, strengthened the legitimacy of this letter. And this book was intending to build a feeling of certainty regarding the mathematician's competence in life insurance, a feeling that was intended to be transformed into trust in the company. And of course, as you may know, being seen as trustworthy represents a significant commercial advantage in the insurance industry. In 1819, following the advice of its three mathematicians, the Compagnie d'Assurance Générale had decided that Duvillard's table would be used for life insurance, and Desparcieux would be used for life annuities. So that was their choice. I haven't found archives about the choice made by the competing company, which was called Compagnie Royale. However, I do know from the archives that they made a different one. I also know that the rates they published offered apparently more considerable advantages to the public than those of the Compagnie d'Assurance Générale. And this was, of course, a problem for the Compagnie d'Assurance Générale because the prices were higher. Thus, Nicolet, Mas, and Rodriguez were asked to make a very detailed examination of the rates of the competing company in order to understand the parameters, the assumptions on which the calculations were based, and ultimately to be able to give a scientific ground to the criticism that could be made of the system set up by the competing company. In fact, at this point, the mathematician's strategy was to argue to the public and to the government the idea that there was only one correct way to proceed and that this way was leading to equitable rents implemented by their company. They argued that the seemingly more advantageous rates set by the Compagnie Royale could only result from what they called fallacious combinations. And following this logic, the mathematicians were given two tasks. One was to draft a kind of memorandum intended to convince the Ministry of the Interior to compel all companies to adopt identical tables in the future. And the other one was to engage discussions with the mathematicians of the competing company in order to reach an agreement. Ultimately, the Compagnie Royale failed to raise the necessary capital to launch its activity in 1920. This effectively settled the issue of standardization of rates, as the Compagnie d'Assurance Générale held the monopoly until the 30s. But regardless of the actual effects of the mathematicians' works, it is interesting to note that their initiatives were based on the idea that their way to proceed was the one and only one which was correct and legitimate. And why? Because, according to what they're saying, it combined rigor of mathematical principle and algebraic calculations. Therefore, this proper way of doing things should necessarily prevail over the competing companies, whether willingly or by force. So, by shifting the debate from the realm of commercial competition to that of this kind of scientific objectivity, the mathematicians did play a central role in the strategy employed by the Compagnie d'Assurance Générale to fix the prices as they desired. And actually, when life insurance industry developed from the 1930s onwards in France, it was indeed from the mortality tables, Duvillard and de Parcieux, that they were made, all of them. So I will just now talk a little bit about the role of scientific institutions in all that story. So first of all, even if it's, as already said, very often hear about the fact that in France, after the Laplace book, there have been nothing done in theory of probability. It's something that you very often hear. There are, however, several evidences that show that academic mathematicians did not abandon either the use of probability theory, either the theory of probability, either its use in the social and economic world. I won't speak about the many courses that were devoted to this topic in Paris at the time. Some of them have been listed by Pierre Crépel or other ones. But instead, I would like to focus here on the question of expert knowledge and the limits of the authority of expert knowledge. So I will take two examples for that. In France, all projects for financial companies related to human life had to be licensed by the government. And from the 1780s to the 1920s, the government consulted the Académie des Sciences several times to form its opinion on such projects. However, as we shall see, consulting does not necessarily mean listening. So we have seen at the beginning of this talk that the Minister Breteuil has tasked Laplace and Condorcet with reviewing a life insurance project. Condorcet and Laplace requested some modification. They worked with the author, particularly to set the premiums, and then they gave a favorable opinion. However, as you may have noticed, it was the Compagnie Royale and not Beaufleury's project that obtained the royal privilege, which actually meant monopoly. Why was that? Because the director of the Compagnie Royale had made to the King's Council a much more tempting financial offer. And in those times of great budgetary difficulties, such an offer was far more valuable than any scientific guarantee even if the scientific had been given by Condorcet and Laplace. In the same way, between 1819 and 1921, Fourier was repeatedly tasked on behalf of the Academy with acting as an expert on the matter for the Ministry of the Interior. The Ministry of the Interior was the one in charge with insurance in France, which is a bit weird, but it was not commerce, balance or something, it was the Interior. So in April 1821, Fourier wrote a very unfavorable report about a project of Tontine. He explained that the Academy could only refuse its approval to an irregular establishment which was contrary to the views of the government and even to the intentions of the authors of the project, which meant that he believed that the author of the project didn't really understood what he was doing. And this highly critical report received some publicity. It was even published in the newspaper Le Moniteur, which was quite read at the time. So it would therefore seem that after such a decisive opinion, the government would oppose any form of tontine. However, Fourier's report did not lead to an official ban, and many tontines flourished in France during the years that followed, including the one Fourier had written about. So some even operated without government authorization, and it was just a disaster for the customers, I would say. But they were not forced to close. And from the 1940s onward, a number of tontine companies applied and received authorization. And even some life insurance company, that's funny, received an authorization to add tontine to the financial products they sell. So another example is linked to the question of life table, mortality tables. So as we already said, the mortality tables used by life insurance in France had been published, one in 1906 and the other one in 1806, and the other one in 1746. This means that they were built from data on population that had lived at the latest in the second half of the 18th century. Already in the 1830s, these tables were criticized for two reasons. On the one hand, people were becoming aware of improvements in living conditions, especially the reduction of mortality due to the smallpox vaccination. And on the other hand, the development of French administration led to hopes, at least, of accessing more numerous, more recent, and more reliable data, and thus, not too far from that, the possibility of constructing new and more reliable tables. In France, the Bureau des Longitudes was in charge of publishing all the statistics related to the French population. And so in 1927, they published a corrected version of Duvillers' table on the ground that, as astronomer Mathieu explained, since that time, not only changes have been observed in various elements of the population, and it is desirable that all necessary documents be gathered to soon construct a new table that better reflects the current state of the population. But the years after, if you look at the document, actually, the Bureau des Longitudes more or less acted as if the accuracy of the mortality tables were either impossible or either not his business. And they recognized at the same time that the table they published in their annuaire were those used by company, but they were not right, they were not accurate. But they also acted on the other time and recognized that the data coming from administration was still not accurate either, and they did nothing more. They didn't get into it. They didn't try to do a better job. As for the Academy of Science, they received several works on mortality tables during that time period. In 1824, for example, Villermé established the influence of social classes, I would say, on mortality. 10 years after Pélis, the one who was working for the Compagnie Royale, sent his work on annuities and pensions, and with his memoir came a new mortality table based on recent data from military pensioners. The year after, we had another work submitted by the well-known Bien-Aimé. And as a sign of the academic interest, these works were the subject of reports, generally long, sometimes nuanced, but very often favorable. Moreover, the Académie des Sciences, as an institution, took up the subject by setting up a special commission on mortality tables and considering the fact that they could maybe award a mention prize for statistics. A mention prize for statistics exists every year in France, but they wanted to devote a special, for a special year, the question to mortality. However, the Academy did not pursue this any further. And its position is very clear in a report from 1837 explaining why it has decided not to award the prize, the mention prize, to a memoir by de Montferrand entitled Mouvement de la Population, which contained a new mortality table by age and sex, even though the report wrote by the Academy was actually very favorable to it. So, in fact, the Academy explained that recommending any mortality table would have given this table a quasi-official status and would engage the Academy of Science responsibility for their use in life insurance. And so the Academy raised blame and reproaches from all those who might have been harmed by the use, while in case they lacked accuracy. So you can see that they did not intend to check the calculation, to check the tables, or to do something. They just say, well, it's more or less not our business. Thus, while data provided by the French administrations and the advances in statistical science could have made it possible, probably from this time, to try to have a table that would be more suited to the actual mortality of the French population, the learned institution did not engage with such an issue. And insurance companies, for their part, waited until the 1860s, to take up the matter, and they eventually published new tables at the very end of the 19th century. In the meantime, Duvillers' table, though recognized as obsolete for a very long time, were systematically used in France. So, in conclusion, I would like to return maybe to 2 points not directly related to the topic, but which are quite general and so related to possible future developments, I don't know, or reflection in history of math. The first is that of sources and archives. We have seen a lot of works and projects based on very new approach to mathematical manuscripts, which raises a lot of very interesting questions today and yesterday. The point I want to make is slightly different. Actually, the sources of mathematics of insurance are mainly preserved outside learned institutions. These research has led me to open doors that are not typically opened when doing history of mathematics, such as those of private archives of companies, of those of the Ministry of Economy, the Ministry of the Interior. So lots of things like that. And I would say that stepping outside my archival comfort zone is sometimes difficult and sometimes it's disappointing, very often. Sometimes a bit frustrating too. But actually I do find it very exciting. And why? Because I think that it's in particular interesting to me in that it allows symmetrically to look with slightly different eyes archives that are more familiar to me, like those of the Academy of Science. And it also forces me to ask myself almost systematically what I do or do not consider to be mathematical. And what the fact I am talking about mathematics than rather of something else changes for the situation I'm looking at. The second point is the dialogue that could be established between the history of mathematics and other fields of the history of science, or even in general history. The history of insurance lies at the crossroad of several historiographical domains, particularly history of quantification, economic history, for instance. But I think this is far from being the only area in which history of mathematics intersects with economic and labor history questions. And from that perspective, I do believe that lots of emerging themes in the history of mathematics could come out from collaboration with historians working on the history of capitalism, or on labor history, or on history of technology. And I'm done. Thank you very much for your attention.
We do have time for one or two questions.
Thank you. Very nice talk. So maybe you said it and I didn't get it, but did they only look into life insurance, or what about non-life insurance too?
Actually, the company, they have several branches. One was life insurance, and the other one was, they have fire insurance, for instance, or maritime insurance. But they were separated from the beginning, from the idea that the risks were not of the same kind, so they were run differently. And the other one, they didn't rely on mathematics, actually.
I have one more.
Sure. Yeah.
So, do you know when did they begin to educate? I mean, have an education in science. I mean, nowadays it's a profession. You have a
The actual science in France, it started to be discipline, I would say, in the 70s, 1870s. 1860s, 1870s. And then you have a society of actuaries, of French actuaries, you have journals of actuaries, and all this kind of institutionalized institution and society, and you have classes and stuff like that. But it's quite later, in fact.
Thank you so much for that. I wanted to quickly ask, you mentioned one letter from a client, from a woman, which forced the company to rethink which table to use. So I'm wondering if you come across more evidence like that, where like interventions or questions or challenges from the public has impacted directly the mathematical theories.
That one, which one? This one? Yeah. Actually, Larocque was not really the public. He was somebody quite versed into financial projects. He had made some projects also, and I think he did that because he knew the topic and he didn't want Duvillard to be the only one to do it. So it was kind of an expert critic remark.
Okay. I think we'll stop because was there one more question?
Yes, but if we have
no, there is time.
No,
please.
Fine, okay. See, given current problems I have, I discovered that the idea is what can be insured, let's say in France or in Germany or in England, is very different beyond a certain minor set of things. Do you have an idea how the idea what can be insured and what should not be insured developed?
Actually, in France, the idea that life should not be insured because life has no price was something that was very strong. And in fact, life insurance was forbidden. I mean, the companies I've shown are the only one who has been allowed at the time. Just before the revolution, life insurance was forbidden. This company tried to manage to open and to get government authorization, and then it was closed during the revolution, as well as any other that would have wanted to do the same thing, just like life insurance were forbidden. And then in the 20s, when the idea was to develop life insurance, but it was also to develop more generally companies, and so. They started to allow life insurance, to authorize it, but it was still complicated. They were very cautious about that because you had, at least in France, this very idea that, well, life has no price. So you should not link it to money.
Thank you. Perfect timing. Thank our speaker again.